So I think that optimism starts with you, I guess, acknowledging the uncertainty, not denying it. And I think that acknowledgement conversation is also about, what's changing in today's reality. I think it's really important to talk a lot about what isn't changing, and often we index into that change, and that change could be a huge change, but typically, in my experience, it's quite a small change, but it can induce that anxiety.
Around the Table is an Illuminaire podcast hosted by John Healy and me, Carice Hutchinson. This podcast is powered by Nuida, developing the next generation of leaders. For over 2 decades, Nuida has partnered with the world's leading financial institutions and technology firms to build the skills, mindsets, and confidence their people need to lead in a digital world. From early career engineers to senior executives, their expert-led training programs help organizations accelerate transformation, adopt AI, and deliver real business impact. Learn more at nuida.com.
Welcome back around the table for another conversation in our series of leadership themes. And the theme for today is optimism. And Carice, I am so delighted that we're going to be joined today by Brendan Mooney from Kainos, one of Northern Ireland's only listed companies, very few, a £1 billion company founded way back in 1986. So we're going to hear from Brendan in a moment. But before we do, I would like to hear some of your thoughts on optimism and the importance of optimism in leadership.
So the word optimism is on the table today. And so there's one thing, if listeners are been following us along in the series, that I like to start with what it's not. Because optimism, I think we can make up our mind and we can think and we can assume or we can misperceive it. So lots of definitions out there, John. There's a lot of different research pieces on this. But when it comes to definitions, actually, contrary to a lot of the common perceptions around this, it is not blind hope. It is not wishful thinking. And it is not the naive omission of reality. So what we're defining here today, John, before we go into our conversation, is we're defining this as a leadership capability to believe that progress is possible and worth working towards, even when the situation is unclear, difficult, or changing. And that really does situate us right now in this grey zone moment, this era that so many as leaders are navigating through.
Carice, I love that. Progress is possible, and it absolutely is. And if ever there's an embodiment of it, it is you, Brendan. 20 years leading Kainos, growing it to the company that it is today. So you definitely have a worldview that says things can be better tomorrow than they even are today. It is an absolute pleasure to welcome you around the table for this conversation today. We've asked all of our guests who come along to bring something with them, to think about an object or a piece of art or a piece of music that has meant something to them on their leadership journey. And I'm really interested to hear, what have you brought along today?
John, Carice, thanks very much for having me here today as well. So I brought with me a pen, and let me explain why it's important to me. This was a gift from the founding CEO at Kainos, a guy called Frank Graham, a absolutely super business person, a super person. And Frank presented it to me on the occasion of us becoming a public company back in 2015. And not only was it just a very generous gift from Frank, but it was also a very appropriate one for me. I'm a great note taker, or I take lots of notes, perhaps than do it greatly. And you can see that in my book here. I write pages upon pages every day. And that writing for me professionally allows me to, I guess, remember what is happening in the meetings or the conversations I'm involved in. It allows me to kind of process that, to kind of make sense of it, to reflect on it as well. So that's how it helps me professionally. And then I use the pen for writing those things to the people I care most about in my life as well. So it kind of transcends both professional and personal as well. And to me, when I use the pen, not all the time, but regularly, I think about Frank and the opportunity he created for me to take over from him in Kainos, about the guidance he gave me during my time before that role and after that role as well. And I think that he introduced me to the concept that optimism is a choice for you as a leader. It's not a personality trait. And I have to perhaps explain that kind of when I came to that realization. So if I skip back to the early part of my career, so I go back to 1994. So Kainos is doing well, it's growing strongly, but all of our clients are in Great Britain. And, Frank had this ambition for us to do more work in the island of Ireland, and I relocated to Dublin. We started to kind of build our presence, our brand inside Dublin. And what that really meant is that as a person taking on a role in a kind of pre-sales capacity, I would go out and meet customers and make suggestions about how we could help them solve some of their technology problems. And it was a really tough thing because we made 62 proposals that failed. So you think of that kind of 18-month period I was there. So pretty much every week or 10 days, I was getting rejected by a customer, and I needed to, I would phone Frank on a Friday afternoon, and he would kind of talk through what happened. He would draw out the learnings for me from that, and he always left, or I left that conversation with Frank feeling much more positive about next week. So I go into the weekend going, okay, that wasn't a great week, but next week could indeed be fantastic. And that's, to me, is what I think about optimism. It's about understanding where you are today, so accepting today's reality, but knowing that the next thing that you do can change your future. Mm-hmm. So to me, that's optimism, and that was my conversation with Frank over 30 years ago.
Wow.
I love that. Optimism is a choice, and I would subscribe to that totally. So would as well, Brendan. And I love this idea that you brought a pen in what is an increasingly digital world.
We're all sitting with pens, John.
We're all sitting with pens, scratching away at notes. The analog still has a big part to play, so it's really full of symbolism in so many different ways. So we dig in on a bit more into optimism. You say it's a choice, but how do you use optimism in the way that you frame the direction and purpose for Kainos? What does that look like? You talked about Frank and saying that that
mm-hmm.
next week's going to be better, but how do you frame it whenever you're on your feet in front of those who are looking to you for leadership?
So I think optimism is often topical in times of uncertainty because things are going well. Mm-hmm. Everybody's optimistic. So it's, to me, maybe today's conversation is framed as how do you keep optimistic in uncertain times? I think that, you use the expression kind of gray zone. I translate that or parse that as being that uncertainty. Mm-hmm. So I think that optimism starts with you, I guess, acknowledging the uncertainty, not denying it. I think that acknowledgement conversation is also about, what's changing in today's reality. But I think it's really important to talk a lot about what isn't changing. And often we index into that change, and that change could be a huge change, but typically, in my experience, it's quite a small change, but it can induce that anxiety. And then, having talked about what's changing and what's not changing, then talking about those priorities that you have around how do you address concerns or how do you deal with the challenge that's there ahead of you as well. And, another aspect of my personality is I'm quite control oriented. So I like to know where we're going and have a sense of that direction. So, it's about focusing in on things that you have control over that aren't outside of your environment. So it's about your customers, it's about innovation, it's about talent development, all the things that make your business great. And that I think is, to me, kind of super important as part of it. You look at the things that you can control in the face of that uncertainty. And I think that, to me, every challenge you encounter is solvable. And I think that you have to start thinking about how you solve that problem. It may feel, I guess, overwhelming at the start, but as you kind of work through it and think about the challenge that's there, it can be solved. And again, that's rooted in a belief that you're working with great people who have got huge intellect and energy and enthusiasm, and they'll be able to help, collectively solve that problem.
What I'm hearing is a real engineer's voice coming through there, that the problems can be solved. I love it.
Yeah, but I think probably my final point in this is that, for us who are leaders in the business, I think presence is really important. Yeah. When people are uncertain, absence creates further anxiety.
Yes.
Whereas presence, I think, gives a sense of confidence.
You're saying yes there, Chris. What does that mean to you?
I think because what you've raised, Brendan, hits on a big question that so many companies are wrestling with, which is remote working. it's that sense of the virtual working. How do you manage virtual teams? I mean, that's a big part of your organizations too. And how do you manage that? And people, what has happened post-pandemic has shifted us in terms of what was not possible, and now we're realizing that remote, but we've lost something in that. So I think I'm just interested to see how do you be fully present whenever you maybe are remote?
Yeah, and
An
you've
oxymoron,
got
but
that extra dimension as well in that you are a global company.
That's
You've
right.
got people
Time
in
zones.
different
Yep.
parts of the world and that different cultural aspect to it. So how do you put those two bits together? You know, the fact that we're all living a bit more in the virtual space post pandemic, and also having to deal with the globality. You know, where does optimism and that kind of bias fit in there?
I think that so on the topic of presence, I mean, we have a philosophy inside Kainos, which is you're asked to do work, a job, a role. How you choose to do that or where you choose to do it from is a decision that you can make. So we have no mandates to attend the office. It's up to people. We judge them on their output, not on where they do the work from. And I think that it's then down to the individual to work out, based on all the information they have, how can they best discharge that role in their personal context. So the reality is that through that kind of 2, 3, 4 years of COVID, where we're all saying work from home, it's the safest place to be there. People build a different life than they had from before COVID, where they attended the office pretty much every day. That's certainly what we did. So now that there's a different reality, they kind of have to work around that. So presence there is more complicated. I think it becomes about communication and how do you simplify that communication so people can understand it quickly. Because if I look at the statistics from our business, if we use email or our internal kind of comms platforms, 85% of what we generate from the company to colleagues is read on their mobile device. So that is while they're moving, while there's notification about something else. So yet they are typically time starved and attention deprived around the message you're giving to them. So how do you make that so easy for them to understand? And again, 40% of our colleagues, English is not their first language, but English is their business language. So I think that being able to create certain things to that audience on a regular basis, and then people have to choose if they feel better placed to do a job in an office, or do they feel better placed to do it kind of blending their experience of sometimes being in the office, sometimes being somewhere else.
So we talked there about the grey zone, and a lot of that is driven by the VUCA world that we're living in, the volatility, the uncertainty, the change, the ambiguity. What's the role of optimism? Because you could get lost in all of that, but really for a lot of us, it is just what's in front of us, and that isn't really changing that much. So how do you see optimism, and how do you then talk about it to your teams right across those time zones and on those different platforms and in those different ways?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's about, again, emphasizing the things that you could be certain of. And I say so much of our business is predictable. There are elements that do vary, but the reality is that we're not in a business that changes very quickly. We do things that help our customers change, but the reality is that we're not asked to make immediate decisions. We're not making any life or death decisions. The reality is our business, even though it can be fast moving, you still have time to consider, think through, to assess the data. And to me, I think that whenever we're thinking about optimism, you start off with what's the data tell you today? How do you build a picture? I think optimism built in data feels like a positive thing. And then optimism without challenge feels slightly dangerous as well. So there's two things there. I mean, I think the first thing about data, so I am a data nerd. I want to see the facts. I want to hear people's opinion afterwards, because opinions are sometimes based on fact and sometimes not. So I want to understand what the data says, and then add the color from someone who perhaps can interpret the data better than I can, for them to say, here's what I know. And then to me, it's a big conversation about, well, if that's what we all think, what should we do about that? And then that conversation around what does that look like? And maybe teams are composed. There's different people with different perspectives. There's a person who's very analytical, the person who's thinking from a finance perspective, or a delivery perspective, or a sales perspective. And hopefully your teams are built that way. If they're not, then you work out how to bring that kind of challenge into the conversation. Because in my experience, I've never met someone who knows everything. I've met some people who think they know everything.
Well, there's definitely plenty who think they know everything.
But the reality is that to me, a collective decision discussion gives a much richer, a much higher quality decision, but also then and through that discussion creates a sense of joint responsibility of that decision and a joint focus on delivering it as well.
Carice, you were very particular in your definition of optimism. You were saying that it's not blind hope, it's not wishful thinking. Within all of our businesses, there are cycles. There's those great peaks whenever everything's going well. There's a troughs whenever things aren't going so well. I'm going to ask you first, Brendan, and maybe you might comment as well, Carice, from the academics. How do you stop falling into the trap of this idea that blind hope, things will just get better just because, as opposed to optimism, which is saying we can make it happen. How do you do that within the business, so that the people in front of you aren't just out there charging forward in blind hope, but actually are moving forward with optimism?
And both those are on the same continuum. The reality is if you remove some of that data-led stuff, which is because when you make a decision, observing the data about progress towards the next milestone is important, and you have to look for that to say, actually, we're making progress, or indeed we're not making progress, because I think you have to adjust. I mean, whenever things are uncertain, you can make a decision, you make a plan, you can set a direction, but that is likely to be wrong. That's just the reality of it. And knowing that it's likely to be wrong, sometimes it's hard to make that decision because you don't want to make a wrong decision. We're instinctively attuned to making the right decision. So, but I think just that forward momentum, sometimes the act of moving forward is an important kind of piece as well. But
although I think it's very interesting what you said, that none of us are making decisions. Well, very few of us are making decisions that are life and death. There are very few decisions that can't be unwound. I think that's something else that that we all need to keep in mind. That as you look to make things better, if you make them worse, you can always course correct.
And the reality is that even when we're making the right decisions, we always adjust them. It's not like a decision is made. That is the end of it. It is a constant kind of adjustment the whole way through as you kind of just slightly fine tune things around that.
Yeah. So what does the literature or what's the research say about things like that, Carice?
Yeah. So one of the things that I'm just listening to your story, that just before I go into that, and it links in, is that what do you do when it doesn't play out? Like, do you know what's the language? There's so much, we're talking about words, John, in this series, and we know words are incredibly powerful, but they're also very cheap. We can use them very blindly. So what kind of language do you use when things maybe don't work out, or decisions are publicly made, but you actually, a sharper change in the course? Or maybe that's never happened.
Oh, it's
part of the journey.
I get as many wrong as I get right. I think that so I have the great pleasure of working with people who are incredibly intelligent, and to me, the first thing is when it's not going wrong, you just say that. There's an admission of that. I think that generally as leaders, if you're involved in that decision, it's incumbent upon you to recognize your role in that wrong decision. And sometimes you have to be the lightning rods where you take a lot of the responsibility. Sometimes it can be shared, but generally, the starting point is that if you're in a decision, you were in the room, you've made a decision, it's gone wrong, you just say it's gone wrong, okay? And then you say, well, there might be some analysis, why did it go wrong? But people are probably less interested in pushing blame, in my experience, and much more interested, okay, now you've learned that, what are you going to do next? And which kind of comes back to my earlier point that, today's reality is fixed, but tomorrow is still unwritten, and you can make those changes, and some of them will take longer to play out and some will be more immediate. But to me, there's that kind of, okay, here's how we're going to change that. And I think that, again, I've only ever worked in Kainos, so I've only a reference point of one, albeit over many years. But to me, people are very accepting of, okay, so we got it wrong. Let's think about the future. Let's jointly get involved in helping make it better.
Well, it may well be a reference point of one, but it's a very successful one. So one that
It's
is
a very long one.
that is worth paying attention to.
Yeah.
I was very struck at the start whenever you said optimism is a choice,
Yeah.
and we're talking about it here today, and people should be thinking around,
Yeah.
maybe that's a choice I should make. But some people don't make that as a choice, and don't bring optimism into their leadership. How do you deal with that? You come across the black hatters, the we're doomed people within business.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that? Maybe you actually have to sometimes pay attention to that. How do you measure it?
Well, John, I think your second point is really relevant here. I mean, I think it's good teams have a
mix
of
Yeah.
perspectives. And the reality is that if you look at some, I'm not at all academically focused, but if you look at some of the tools you might use around testing a plans or doing a pre-mortem, what might go wrong, or using the kind of the 6 hats
Yes.
to kind of play out different perspectives. In that you need someone who is the cautious one, the one who sees the risks and how they might materialize, and that's kind of really important, because if you're all kind of charging forward, with a mixture of optimism, blind hope, and delusion, right? That's not
a strategy.
So you need to have people who can try and say, well, no, have you thought about this? And to me, that adds to the richness of the conversation, the benefit of the decision as part of that. So, you may not want to go out and have a couple of drinks with them on a Friday night at the pub if they're going to sit there kind of crying into their pint, but absolutely, it's really important to have different perspectives.
Yeah.
So you might need a bit of that mix within the team to temper unbridled optimism.
Yeah, and the research tells us that, John. Just back to what you were saying. I mean, I read a book. It was sort of a year into COVID, and it was by a thought leader researcher called Tali Shiro, an Israeli, and she actually talks about that, and she says that we need to be careful that when it comes to deploying optimism in business, and with good reason, if we have too much of us, it can lead us astray. The research is really compelling on this, but too little will dim our spirit and will actually keep us with a real lack of hope and belief that there is that possibility and choice. And what she refers to is, she talks about the golden mean of moderate optimism. That balanced mindset that enables sound decisions and pragmatic action, that both personally and professionally. So we often think about leadership, it's here in a work or a business context, but it's how you lead right across your whole life. So she talks about this virtue of balance and how it's really important that leaders cultivate that, why they can actually hope and strive for the best while actually keeping their feet firmly planted in the reality of the situation. And the fact that life is unpredictable. There's just so much that is predictable in terms of into the future. But the other two headlines, John, when it comes to the research, if we first look at it in terms of like an individual level, like as a leader, decades, and we're talking decades of research here, is really compelling that it actually shapes our approach to life. It's like a fundamental force that elevates our mood. We'd all take that, and how much we need that when we read so much of the news headlines. But it actually propels us towards achievement and reaching our goals. That is the force of optimism. And it's because optimism, whenever you break it down as a construct, it is actually a key player in how we learn from disappointment. It's that ability, and one of our words in this series is failure, and how that the ability to actually learn valuable lessons is actually critical to fueling our optimism, because it enables leaders not to stay stuck in the failure and the disappointment, and actually to cultivate some resilience. And the second headline is around the impact for organizations and businesses. You can go into all sorts of organizational psychology in this. One is psychological capital, but they actually say that actually it has a real impact in teams and cultures across the organization, where it actually helps our staff and our people not to feel overwhelmed, and to have that sense of confidence to navigate when there are many options maybe on the table that you have to make a decision on. And the other aspect that when it comes down to culture is, if you have that mindset that we can learn, we can always learn. Back to one of the first words in our series is actually humility, that openness and that teachability. that actually is something really powerful that shapes culture. So some big headlines, John, and I'm thinking now of people that are listening to your story, Brendan, and listening to the research. I'm wondering, gosh, wonder where I am. We talk about the glass half full and half empty. And sometimes we think, oh, that's just the way I am. But it is actually a choice. It's actually a decision. So here's some questions. I always like to leave listeners with some questions. If you're listening, when you're faced with uncertainty, what story do you instinctively tell yourself about how this will turn out? So something happens, unpredictable. What's your instinct? And the second question is, do you assume that progress is possible? Or do you always anticipate loss, threat, or failure? Now, we can do this as leaders. We can have a good old journal and we can get the pen out and we can write in our journal. But
I'm
I
not
don't.
sure if she's giving you a bit of critique there with your pen
Absolutely
and your
not.
notepad.
I'm actually
Taking notes there,
totally and
Brendan.
utterly on the same page, excuse the pun, but actually invite a few people, some of those critical friends and colleagues that will actually give you, because they're coming with the fact that they want to see you grow and learn. Ask them, well, how am I when the conversations get tough and unpredictable? But yeah, the research is compelling and it is a choice and it's something that we can grow and we can learn from.
Carice, you always set some very interesting homework for our listeners to take away,
terrible trait, yeah.
to take away and bring into their leadership practice, and it's great to have it. And my big takeaway from this conversation is how it was opened in terms of optimism being a choice, and a force that propels you in your leadership journey, and for many people who are listening today, they're thinking about their leadership. Some are only maybe starting on their leadership journey, and there's a compelling thought for everybody to think about, that optimism could help propel you, but not this kind of blind hope.
Remember in the golden
thinking.
mean, John, the golden mean is a moderate optimism, to have that possibility but firmly planted in reality.
So we've heard the science from you, Carice. It's compelling. We've explored some of that, those starting points with you, Brendan, and your story, and I definitely want to give you the last word. And as you think about what you've said, and some of that input from Carice, what do you hope that the aspiring leaders who might be listening to this podcast, what would you like them to take away from the conversation around the table here today?
Yeah, I'd probably be slightly cautious. I mean, in terms of what can people take away, because everybody's situation and context is different. So they gotta work with that. But I guess three things that I think of probably quite a lot. One is about as a leader, you need to be, I guess, balanced. So you have a tricky job to do, which is to root yourself in today's reality, recognizing the challenges that are there, but at the same time have a belief that you can solve that challenge. And it's not easy to do that. But that's your job as a leader, is to work that through. So whether you do it instinctively or you have to work through some kind of little process in your mind, I think that's the first thing. The second thing is about the creativity, both the belief, but also working with people to solve the problem. Again, every problem I think is solvable, and certainly in our business in terms of that as a context. So how do you go about solving that problem? And the third thing, and I think it's really important, is about, as you go through that process of how do you solve the problem, you have to act. You can't wait for the perfect decision, because we all know it doesn't exist. And sometimes looking for more data is delaying something that you may not want to do or you feel uncomfortable with as well. So I think that just starting that momentum, knowing that, as you make that forward path, you will adjust it to become more correct over time. But you can't start off broken out. How do you make that perfect at the very start? So to me, just being able to start to see progress, to share that progress with the team, to say, actually, we are doing things that are making a difference, and that's a positive difference. So that would be me. It's about that balance, that creativity, and then finding out by acting on it.
Well, that's a fantastic place for us to finish the conversation here today. For anybody who's interested in Kainos, the journey they've been on, your leadership of that, they can find out more on the Kainos.com website. It's a company, and your leadership of it is something that I've looked at for years, Brendan, and your optimism for that company really just shines through. In terms of the conversation that we've had here today, and in fact for all the conversations that we've had around the table, you can get more on those by checking out Illuminaire's leadership letters on Substack and at the website. And for me to finish up here today, I just want to thank you, Chris, my fellow co-host for the podcast, and especially to thank you, Brendan, for giving your time so generously and coming along to share your thoughts on optimism with us around the table on this podcast. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Many thanks to David Glendenning, an artist from Northern Ireland who provided the soundtrack for this podcast show.